Yeah. Hey, why don't you throw a little whiskey in this for me, will you? All right. Oh, hey, how you doing? Okay, today we're going to be talking about one of the earliest serial killers or vampires that we know of from Europe in around 1600. Although I suppose if you are a vampire, you are also by definition a serial killer. So this is an interesting question. We're going to be looking at a very famous case of a woman, and not just a woman, but a princess, who is one of the most prolific killers in human history. Her name is Elizabeth Bathory, pronounced Elizabeth Bathory. She's Hungarian, and I'm going to tell you her story, and we're going to reflect on the nature of vampires and serial killers. So, first I want to read to you an interesting little account from the 1600s, and this is from a newspaper. This is collected together by a French monk who put together a collection of actual vampire stories. And when I say stories, I mean reports that were purported to be nonfiction in newspapers and pamphlets. And here's what he says. He's describing the kind of vampires. He says in 1693 and 1694, there's news of opires, not vampires, but opires, and also vampires or ghosts, which are seen in Poland and above all in Russia. Quote, they come and suck the blood of living men or animals in such abundance that sometimes it flows from them at the nose and principally at the ears, and sometimes the corpse swims in its own blood oozed out in the coffin. This reviving being, or opire, what we would call a vampire, comes out of his grave, or a demon in his likeness goes by night to embrace and hug violently his near relations or his friends, and sucks their blood so much as to weaken and attenuate them, and at last cause their death. Now, end quote here for the reading, but fascinating issue here. First of all, it's not just that the vampire gets out of the coffin and goes and wreaks havoc. The vampire could actually be still laying in the coffin, but sending a sort of vivified demon out into the world and to do its blood sucking, and I suppose to bring it back to the body that's still inside the coffin. Unclear. What's interesting about this too is that the vampire, certainly from many stories I've read, feeds primarily on its own family. And this is very interesting because as the family starts to wither away and get sort of sicker and sicker, what happened is people were basically, when this was really happening to people, it was called consumption. And consumption was the name of a disease that seemed like it was slowly consuming you and basically just wearing you down and basically consuming you from within. You get increasingly thin and frail and lacking in vitality and power. And we now call that disease tuberculosis. What's fascinating is there's a case just like this one that's being described here that occurred not that long ago in the United States in Exeter, Rhode Island, sort of New England vampire scare. A sad case of a woman named Mercy Brown. Mercy Brown was from a large family, and there was sort of consumption going around. They didn't know what it was. Family members are basically withering away and dying, and they dig up the relatives, one of which is a young girl named Mercy Brown. And they look at the corpses and they see basically normal composition. But in the case of Mercy Brown, she doesn't seem to be very, how should we say, withered, dried out, and rotting. And that's because she had been buried just the year before in a freezing cold winter. So she was probably just on ice, so to speak. But the family decides, okay, this is a sign of vampirism. She must be leaving the grave and then coming and feeding on family members. So they dig out her heart and her liver, and they burn it, and then they essentially make from the ashes a kind of tincture or tonic, and then they have other family members drink this medicine, in particular the brother of Mercy Brown, Edwin Brown. And sad to say, Edwin is dead within months anyway, because they don't know what they're doing. It's tuberculosis, it's not vampires. But it's a fascinating story, and it gives you a lot of insight into vampire lore and why it's there, and what it has to do with the sort of withering away of the family. And they would look at dead relatives and see, is there fresh blood in them? So they would sort of go into the grave and cut them open and see, is there anything there? Because if there's blood in there, then the suggestion was they must be feeding on family members. And then some desecration would follow, usually the head being cut off, various organs being harvested for medicines and so forth. Today, on Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge, we're going to be talking about vampires and serial killers, and in particular, Elizabeth Bathory. Welcome. Our subject today, Elizabeth Bathory, is actually a princess. She is Transylvanian. She marries young, and what we know about her is that there are some sort of legends about her, and then there are some historical facts. And what I want to do is sort of compare and contrast what we know about her. The legend and the historical facts corroborate that she was very beautiful. She had sort of jet black or sort of raven black hair. She had amazing, pure and beautiful complexion, and this is going to be important because of the blood drinking that we're going to be getting to. She was born in the late 1500s and dies in 1614. She's actually arrested in 1610 and goes on trial, found guilty in 1611, although she doesn't really have a trial, and we're going to get to that. But she is essentially an extremely smart, well-educated young woman. She knows many European languages. She knows Greek and Latin. She studies the classics. She's basically a typical aristocracy of the time. She's part of, sort of connected to the Habsburg family, but her family is in tension with the Habsburgs. The Bathorys and the Habsburgs are in tension, as we'll see here later. What's interesting about her is that the legend is that she grew up in a very violent sort of family, and not just her, but sort of everybody at this time. Aristocrats were constantly abusing the peasants and the serfs that worked under them. The legend has it that she saw a very violent execution of a woman who had been accused of kidnapping. And this woman was actually sewn into the belly of a dead horse. This was her punishment. First, you break the arms and legs of the person, you stuff them inside a dead horse, you sew it back up, and then the person either dies of suffocation, or if they can live long enough, they're eaten by predator animals that come to feed on the dead horse. So this was not exactly sport, but it was a common punishment. Usually it was reserved for nobility or really terrible crimes. It actually reminds me of a punishment that the Romans used to engage in, and this punishment was called punishment by sack, or pene culae. It was basically meted out to people who had committed patricide or matricide. If you killed your parents in the ancient world, hey, look, killing your parents is bad anytime, but killing your parents in the ancient world was the worst. The ancients thought, well, look, you owe everything to your parents, so that's the worst and most heinous crime possible. So you got a pretty heinous punishment. And the punishment was they sewed you inside a sack with a variety of different animals, particularly predator animals, mostly vipers of some kind. And then, to make it worse, they threw you in the river. So that punishment was, that's when crucifixion is too good for you, apparently. So anyway, this is a similar kind of punishment. Elizabeth seems to have seen it at a very young age. And her own father, the legend has it that she saw him cut the ears and noses off peasants that were trying to revolt against him. So it was a bloody, brutal time. And as I said, it was sort of brutal for everybody. But you can see why scholars would want to talk about the childhood of Elizabeth Bathory, because whenever you have a serial killer like this, you want to know, like, why did they turn out this way? And it's very common to think about the childhood. Actually, it's more common after Freud, where we understand that the childhood, however that is, sort of produces the adult in more ways than one. Because if it's a brutal childhood, it could lead to psychopathologies. So people looked into her childhood to see what could have made her so sadistic later in life. In any case, she may or may not have been raped and had an illegitimate child at a very young age, I believe somewhere around 14. But in any case, she was married a year later to another wealthy family. And in this case, this turned out to be not only sort of the romance of her life, but also a fellow sadistic torturer, so that they were like a power couple of torturers. Elizabeth's husband's name was Count Ferrance. And Count Ferrance turns out to be, not just wealthy and, with many castles, but also he's a highly respected general. And so the king asks Count Ferrance to actually lead the entire Hungarian army against the Ottoman Empire, which he does. And so for many years, he's off fighting these campaigns against the Ottomans. And he's gone most of the time. And so Elizabeth lives on her own with attendants, servants, maidens, and all kinds of people who work in the castle with her. When Count Ferrance returns home, he seems to, according to legend, have acquired all kinds of new torture techniques. And so he and Elizabeth start to get a taste for hurting the peasants who work for them and the servants. So for example, Count Ferrance strips one of the servant girls naked, covers her in honey, and then basically exposes her out in the elements until eventually she dies of insect bites and exposure. He also lights some of the servant girls on fire and even creates a kind of glove, which is like a Freddy Krueger glove, where you put it on and it has knives coming off of the fingers, and apparently teaches Elizabeth how to use this against the servant girls. So the legend is that they were both sadists, and they were both sort of challenging each other and sort of pushing into more and more forbidden territory in terms of sadism. Now, when he would go off on his campaigns, then Elizabeth started to forge connections with local sorcerers and witches. In fact, she writes a letter back to Count Ferrance, who's out in the field, and the letter says, she's found a really good spell. Quote, "Catch a black hen and beat it to death with a white cane. Keep the blood and smear a little of it on your enemy. If you get no chance to smear it on his body, obtain one of his garments and smear it." This is very common in witchcraft. This is the sort of, you're familiar with the idea of a kind of a voodoo doll, where if you get an item of clothing, it is still connected energetically with the subject. So if you abuse the one thing, you can abuse the other. It's a very common sort of theme of correspondences between things within magic. So some of the things that Elizabeth is actually accused of doing to servants and local girls is she would basically put knives or blades under their nails. She would cut their fingers off. She basically would expose them to the elements, like pour cold water on them and then put them, naked, and then put them out into the winter just to see like how they would die of the elements. She flogged them with nettles, those sort of stinging nettles that just lacerate and burn the skin. She would basically use hot pliers to rend the flesh off of them. She was said to also put hooks into the mouths and basically open up the mouths, like just cut the mouths open. And she developed some of this under the tutelage of a witch named Anna Darvulia. Now at this point, young victims are disappearing. But the thing about the story is, it's echoed in many other kinds of stories like this too, is that the aristocracy can get away with murder, quite literally. And so while there are complaints being lodged and people are going missing, there's also basically an epidemic happening at this time. So people are dying from diseases and disappearing, and so oftentimes, like, many people will die. Like in a week, 10 people in a little hamlet will die. So Elizabeth decides to sort of blame these missing girls on this epidemic, and then she supposedly buries them before anybody can see the body. Legend has it that when the heat got too much at one castle, she would move to another castle like miles away, and then she could start over again without raising suspicion. Here's the vampire angle. The legend has it that Elizabeth, who's a highly moody person, gets extremely angry at one of the servant girls because the servant girl messes up her hair. She's supposed to be doing her hair properly, she does it wrong, and Elizabeth basically just attacks her with a knife. The blood sprays onto Elizabeth and it basically covers her, and she realizes later that where the blood was, her skin looks great, just fantastic. And she infers that blood, especially the blood of these young girls, must be especially good for the vitality of the skin and for vitality generally. And this, of course, is a common view, that the blood does seem to be the main sort of elemental source of vitality. So many vampire stories and horror stories involve the sort of drinking of other people's blood in order to gain immortality or vitality. The sort of interesting angle here, however, is that Elizabeth decides that she should start bathing in the blood of her victims. And so she starts engaging in blood showers and blood baths. And she looks youthful and vital, and this is a way for her to keep her vitality. At one point, in order to get more victims, Elizabeth opens up a girls' school, like a finishing school. So now, sort of more noble families can send their daughters to the castle to learn manners and to learn sort of education and maybe to learn how to read the classics. And she starts murdering them as well and bathing in their blood. Well, that's too much, because while the peasants apparently are disposable, the nobles aren't. And so the nobles start to send complaints. Their daughters are going missing. They go into the castle and then they're missing and they never come back, and there's all kinds of weird stories about where they've gone. So what happens is the king, Matthias, basically enlists the skills of one of his most effective military agents, a guy named Jorge Torzo. And Jorge Torzo goes and does a secret investigation, and 52 witnesses come forward and are interviewed and basically tell the same story. Murder, torture, and cannibalism are going on inside the castle. So Torzo realizes he's got a serious situation on his hands, but he realizes because she's a very powerful, wealthy royal, he's going to have to catch her sort of red-handed. And so he sets up a sting operation, and he catches her in the process of torturing young girls. So he pulls in Elizabeth Bathory and 3 or 4 of her servants and interviews them and interrogates them. They all basically accuse each other of committing these crimes, and they find all these corpses in the castle. So now Jorge Torzo has a real issue on his hands here. He doesn't feel like he can try Elizabeth Bathory for the crimes, partly because she's an aristocrat. And if you were to sort of put her through a trial, it really looks bad on all aristocrats. And so, closing ranks with Elizabeth, he decided to simply brick her up and put her under a kind of house arrest rather than put her through a trial. Now, that didn't save the servants, of course, and records show that these 3 servants were actually interrogated and then they were burned alive. There were charges also of witchcraft and sorcery, charges of cannibalism, blood drinking, and vampirism. And so it was a complete shit show, essentially. Now, what happens next is interesting. Elizabeth continues to protest her innocence, but she can't get out of the castle. She basically is just bricked in there. Slowly, over a number of years, she gets weaker and weaker, and eventually she dies. The women who were interviewed, the servants, claimed that there were something like 50 or 60 murders that occurred. But legend has it that Elizabeth Bathory kept her own diary or registry of victims, and that diary seems to have listed over 600 women who were murdered by Elizabeth Bathory. Then Elizabeth, once she dies, is buried. The people, the locals are like, we don't want her around here. She's a vampire. So they exhume her and they bury her somewhere else. She's then exhumed again and reburied. Finally, in the 1990s, they basically go to the family crypt and look for her, and she cannot be found. Her body is nowhere to be found, and that is still the case today. So now that's the legend of Elizabeth Bathory. Now I want to tell you what we know historically about Elizabeth Bathory, and it's a very, very different story. Okay, a wonderful historian named Alexandra Bartosiewicz has written a pretty clear sort of compilation of the actual historical data that we have on Elizabeth Bathory, and she offers a very different thesis about Elizabeth Bathory. One of the things she notices right away is that the whole story is all legend until the 1980s, when historians start to finally look at it. And since the 1980s, there's been a few books. I read a number of papers and books on the topic that have been much more accurate. But the historical record is still very imperfect, and there's a lot of room for speculation here. I want to take you through a few of the things we do know. Yes, Elizabeth was said to be beautiful. We know that from the actual historical record. Yes, she was married to Count Ferrance, and they had 6 children. Yes, she had some kind of school for young girls, and seemed to have been devoted to education of some kind. Now, here's where things go awry. None of the early sadistic childhood can be corroborated. So the story of her actually witnessing an execution of this woman being stuffed into the belly of a horse, none of that is corroborated. And historians don't think that story is true, because horses at that time would have been much more valuable than the peasants. So you wouldn't kill a horse just to kill a peasant. That kind of a punishment would have been saved for nobles or somebody who would, was really special. So that's kind of a sad fact that throws cold water on the execution story. There's no real evidence that her husband, Ferrance, was a sadist, or that she engaged in these torture stories. So that's kind of significant. There are references to it in these sort of interrogations of the trial, so that's where that's coming from. But this different historical interpretation will show you why those may be untrustworthy. We do know, as a point of fact, that it was in 1610 that Elizabeth was arrested by Jorge Torzo and was accused of torture and murder. And we also know the original charges did not include sorcery or witchcraft, but local clerics tried to insert that into the charges, tried to force Torzo to add witchcraft to the charges. And I think that's fascinating. Fascinating for all kinds of reasons. Obviously, this is a sort of a common move that the church would make, but it's interesting too that witchcraft and alchemy, that kind of stuff was not as suspicious at 1610 in Hungary as it would have been in Italy, let's say. I mean, for example, look, in 1600 is when Giordano Bruno is actually burned at the stake in Rome at the Campo di Fiori. And, they had no truck with witchcraft or even just this sort of crazy, interesting metaphysics that Giordano Bruno was offering. The church wasn't having it. But in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, under the Habsburgs, alchemy, magic was much more tolerated, and even Emperor Rudolph II, who was alive during the time of Elizabeth Bathory and ruling, was himself very much interested in witchcraft and alchemy and was engaging in all of this stuff. So this is a very interesting time, and to be accused of witchcraft is not the simple thing it was that we might be thinking of with regard to like Salem witchcraft. Okay, one thing we know also from the historical record is that she was fascinated by not black magic and sorcery, but natural magic. And it's quite possible that some of the women that she was working with that were accused of being sadistic sorcerers were in fact just midwives and sort of practitioners of natural medicine. They would have been involved in bloodletting. They would have been involved in the development of herbal remedies and also taking care of the midwife duties. So this is sort of a common theme you see in witchcraft accusing situations, where oftentimes the women are engaging in what we would call natural medicines, but they're demonized as engaging in sorcery. And it's possible that Elizabeth Bathory was also engaged in this. There's going to be blood, and that's one of the things that may have been misunderstood by the servants who reported her and the suspicious people who saw what was going on there, because they could have been in fact engaged in just bloodletting behaviors and activities. I mean, bathing in blood is almost certainly not something that happened. For one thing, you would need something like 30 girls, the blood of 30 girls to take one bath. So, that alone suggests that that never happened. Doesn't rule it out entirely, but I'm going to go with a kind of naive optimism. Well, it's an informed optimism about how much blood the human body can hold. Anyway, so why was everyone accusing Elizabeth Bathory of being a vampire and a witch and a torturer? Here's the theory that's an alternative to her being a serial killer or a vampire. The alternative is that the locals disliked her family. Her family, Bathory's family, was Hungarian and the locals were Slovak. And the idea is that they really just didn't like these sort of foreigners in their land ruling over them as aristocrats, and so there was a general hostility. So they could have ginned up a lot of these sort of stories as a way to draw attention from the king and eventually get rid of her. There's another theory that seems much more compelling, and it has to do with Gheorghe Torzo. One of the things that's really interesting is that there's a tension in this region and at this time between the Bathory family, Elizabeth Bathory's entire extended family, and the Habsburgs. And so there's a battle to control this region between the Habsburgs and the Bathories. And so there's evidence in 1608 that Elizabeth Bathory's cousin, Gabriel Bathory, was looking to sort of mount a sort of military campaign to reunite the Hungarian regions of the time, and basically to take it back from the Habsburgs. The Bathories have very strategic castles under Elizabeth's control and great wealth. And so the theory was that King Matthias and Gheorghe Torzo, working with the Habsburgs, were basically interested in cutting off Elizabeth's wealth and her strategic locations so that her cousin Gabriel Bathory could not use those in a fight against the Habsburgs. And so the idea is that the entire trial and the entire spectacle was ginned up by Torzo and the sort of Habsburgs as a way of essentially eliminating the Bathories from political control and separating them from their wealth. That theory has a lot of credence, although it's not held sway, but it would explain some of the weird features of the trial. Let's sort of set that aside and just remind ourselves of what we're looking at. We've got Elizabeth Bathory the vampire, we've got Elizabeth Bathory the serial killer, and now we've got Elizabeth Bathory the victim of a political conspiracy. Fascinating story. I'm not going to rule out any of those. I find them all, just gripping. I actually find the serial killer thing fascinating too, because we don't know what to do with serial killers from this time period. Some people look at the story like Voltaire, the famous French philosopher, looks at it and says, oh, this whole thing was concocted by these people who were superstitious, which is why we need an enlightenment. because Elizabeth Bathory was probably persecuted by superstitious people. And later, the late 19th century, early 20th century, we have this sort of great Hermetic magician, Aleister Crowley, and Crowley also suggests that Elizabeth Bathory was framed. But if you come forward a little bit into the 1950s, you'll find another wonderful French philosopher, intellectual named Georges Bataille. And Georges Bataille really loved all this dark, creepy, weird, sadistic stuff. And he wrote a number of books about it. And he said, no, Elizabeth Bathory as a serial killer is probably real. You're just too afraid to look at how evil human nature can be. And so this sort of dark heart of human beings is on display in the sadism of Elizabeth Bathory, he suggests. You just don't want to look at it. So, all right, so that's, those are sort of the three theories about her. Okay, the upshot of all this is if you're not intrigued by Elizabeth Bathory, then you are dead already. Come back next time for more of Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. See you then.